We're in the 11th parak of HaKorbanot. Yoni, if you want to interact, so unmute yourself if you have a question or something, and don't be afraid. There's just a few of us here. There's no one live with us, so if you want to join in, so please feel free to do so. I'm going to open up my Rambam over here. Also, I took my notes over here. Some very interesting sugyas. Every day I learn something new. Because these halachas are not practiced. There's a disconnect. We could learn them as thoroughly as we can. We could try to memorize these halachas, but then a question suddenly comes up. There's no experience. There's no one you could really ask about it. Yeah, I was on Har HaBayis yesterday. Thank God there's a Talmidei Chacham who go there. We haven't seen Rabbi Brandon in a while. I hope he's well. Rabbi Weber, for example, is very knowledgeable about all these things. And I had a question also about the practical keeping of Tumah and Tara, which is also, for many of us, it's only limited to, at least for the women, going to the mikvah as nidas, and that's it. It's and they're machmir for zivus, and for everything else, it's just basically non-existent. We dunk our kalim, but that's not because of Tumah and Tara purposes. People don't realize that when you have Tumah and Tara as a governing rules in your daily life, you'll have to take cups to the mikvah a lot more often. For example, this glass cup is not sufficient that we dunk it once when it's brand new. If it got contaminated, we have to dunk it every time. So we should get used to that. In the olden days, they didn't have necessarily kalim mikvah and a people mikvah. It was just a mikvah. And nowadays, obviously, we've made a clear division between the two. They don't want sometimes glass vessels break in the mikvah, and if then a person would go in there, he could really hurt himself, step on the glass. Okay, so we've improved things. Our mikvahs are a lot more hygienic than they used to be. So we've made it easier to keep the commandments. So I hope to see the restoration also of the practice of Tumah and Tara and Am Yisrael. We're over here, I think, in the 5th halacha, talking about eating that which should not be eaten. The chapter started with the prohibition of eating, for example, a piece of the burnt offering. Here it says, Kol chel kazayat mibasar kodshei kodshim. They spell it with a vav here. And actually, I don't think the Rambam spelled it with vavs. It's a kamatz katan there in both cases. Chutz la'azara lokeh. Whoever eats any meat of the kodshei kodshim, those are the types of sacrifices that only kohanim can eat, the sin offering and the guilt offering, outside of the temple courtyard, should be lashed. Shenemar lo tuchal le'achol bisharecha masar deganecha b'karacha v'tzonecha. The pasuk says you shall not be able to eat within your gates any of the tithe of your grain, your cattle, or your sheep. But this isn't talking about tithes, and it's not bisharecha. Sometimes bisharecha means other cities in the land of Israel, but not necessarily Jerusalem. So the Rambam explains that yes, this is beyond just the simple reading, the literal reading. There's a tradition. They learn from the tradition that this is a warning. Thou shalt not to those who would eat of the meat of the sin offerings and the guilt offerings. By the way, sin offering we always said is perhaps an inaccurate translation. Outside of the temple courtyard. By the way, whenever we say temple courtyard, la'alacha, we mean the inner courtyard, the one that's immediately surrounding the temple edifice and the altar, but not, let's say, the women's courtyard, so-called women's courtyard, which is immediately to its east, or the courtyard to the west or to the north. And by the way, the same law applies to anybody that's kodashim kalim, let's say the peace offerings, Korban Pesach, Thanksgiving offering, the rest that everybody else can eat, types of sacrifices eaten within Jerusalem, outside of Jerusalem. They should also be last. Shechomat Yerushalayim lekodashim kalim. The wall of Jerusalem is to the lesser holy sacrificial foods, as the wall of Jerusalem, the wall of the Azarah for most holy. It says Kechomat Azarah lekodshei kodashim. Each one of these sacrificial foods has its border. So the wall of Jerusalem for the Kodshei Kalim, and the wall of the Azarah for the Kodshei Kodshim. And by the way, there's a similar one for Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach is, yes, it has to be eaten within Jerusalem, but once it's brought into the house in which it's to be eaten, it actually has the walls of that house, that actual room, so to speak. It cannot even be removed from room. It has to be eaten within that room. Yeah, very interesting. Only Korban Pesach has that special din. Ve'echad b'sar hatav washam. O Sherei Menachot. This rule, which is talking about the Kodesh Kodeshim, the only that which the Kohanim can eat, is talking about the meat of the sin offering, the guilt offering, and the parts of the meal offerings that the Kohanim are allowed to eat. Besar Kodeshei Kodeshim Sheyatzah Chutz L'Choman Hazarah. Let's say you had some meat, most holy sacrifices, actually left the boundaries, okay, of the temple courtyard, went beyond the walls. Or the less holy food, it left the walls of Jerusalem, nifsal. So it has become disqualified, and now it's completely forbidden forever. Okay, there's no way it can be fixed. And by the way, also for Korban Pesach, once Korban Pesach is in its particular place where it is to be eaten, if someone were to remove any of that meat, or even it gets removed by some sort of passive method, there's no actual Jew who did it, pulled out by a mouse, it says, or something or other, it fell off the plate and rolled out the door. So that meat is disqualified and should be burned. Even if someone were to take this sacrificial meat back to its place of consumption, it's already been disqualified. So it's forbidden to eat it. Well, and one who eats an olive-sized amount of its meat should be lashed. That means this is the threshold for punishment. If he eats less than this, he's done something wrong, but he is not liable to punishment. This is the minimum shiur. And usually when Rambam says, afilu kazayith, just all he has to eat is an olive. And as we saw, an olive is, when the Rambam says that, apparently he actually meant an actual olive, like even today, because olives haven't really changed that much in the last few thousands of years that people have been using olives for their own purposes. No more than 5 cc or so. As it says, Shnemar uvsar vasar basadet trifa lo tochelu. If you have meat of an animal that was torn, an animal that had been preyed upon by some other animal outside, don't eat it. So, on its most basic level, this is the prohibition of eating meat of an animal that had been killed through some other way that not shechita, it had been killed by another animal, or it was shechted, that means properly Jewish slaughter, but found to have some sort of disease or a wound, an injury that would have killed it within the year, and it's still disqualified. It's a non-kosher food. That's what most basically means. But the sages have, like Rav Shechter says, another level of interpretation, Kewan sheyatzah basar chutz lemechitzato, because this meat went outside of its mechitzas. Mechitza is the official halachic term for a partition. A mechitza can consist of, if I was listening, it consists of a solid stone wall of a city like Jerusalem or the temple courtyard, or it can merely be the curtains, the flimsy embroidered curtains, which was actually kind of see-through. I think they were made of mostly linen, as surrounded the tabernacle in the desert and in Shiloh and in Nov. It was basically poles with these curtains surrounding it, the curtains threaded around the poles to encapsulate an area of 50 by 100 amos. That's still mechitza also. Both are halachically mechitzas. So once meat goes beyond whatever established mechitza it has, naaseh ketreifa. It's considered like what we say in Yiddish, treif, meat, an animal that had been killed. Just as we described also when we talked about kosher food, there's a whole halacha section of food that should not be eaten. So here it's talking about treifa. Treifa means you can't eat it, do something else with it. But by the way, treifa, so you could use for other purposes. You could feed it to the dog, for example, or sell it to the Gentile. But this kudshim that has become disqualified, you can't just dispose of it anyway. There's an official way of disposal. We have a question coming in. The unique issue with Korban Pesach and the walls of the home is consistent with the Rabbi Grossman observation that Korban Pesach Shem Mitzrayim turns the doorpost in the Mizbeach and Judaic home into Mikdash. That's true. And not only that, I was trying to prove that even eating Korban Pesach today, Korban Pesach Lidoros, the eternal Korban Pesach, wherever is eaten within Jerusalem, or as it was in Shiloh or in Givon or in Nov, turns that particular house into the temple. And that's why you have this particular rule concerning that house or that building. If they were to eat Korban Pesach, let's say in the Rova, nowadays there's a large square in what's the so-called Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem. If you were to get together there and have Korban Pesach, like last year when we were supposed to have Korban Pesach, so they would basically enclose themselves. They would bring mechitza somehow, they would build makeshift mechitzas like we have when we want to daven in a place that usually doesn't have mechitza, and they would have to eat the korban pesach within that place, and then suddenly the korban pesach enjoys all these rules that don't apply to any other korban of similar status. Let's say eating a regular peace offering, a person would not have to tell everybody, okay, you have to all act like Kohanim. There's a whole list of halachas that way. So, yeah, I guess we'll plug the Haggadah Pesach. Oh, I don't have my copy behind me. Go get yourselves a copy of Haggadah Pesach so that you can prepare, God willing, for this coming Passover when we should all participate in the sacrificial service. Okay, let's finish this halacha. Nichnas b'sar kodashim kalim la'ichal. Let's say Kodashim Kalim came into the actual temple structure for whatever reason. A person had his shlama meat that he has to now take to wherever it is he's going to be eating in Jerusalem, and it entered the temple edifice for whatever reason. I don't know, by mistake. It's still kosher. Going into the actual temple doesn't disqualify it. Let's see the next one. Hold on. Let's turn the page down here. Zar. We said a zar is anybody not a Kohen. Look at. So if you have, let's say, a Levite or a regular Jew present, the Kohanim are eating the sin offering, not the burnt offering. No one eats the burnt offering. They're eating a sin offering that day in the temple courtyard after the blood has been thrown. Okay, the blood, that's the first stage. They catch the blood, the Kohanim take the blood to the altar, they apply the blood to the altar according to the methods we have seen before. And then the other Kohanim are to take apart they're supposed to skin the sacrifice, take it apart, put the entrails and the forbidden fats on the altar also to burn. And most of the meat is eaten by those Kohanim. So someone who's not a Kohen took a piece of this meat and ate it, so he is to be lashed. Shenemar, Ve'achalu otham asher kupar bahem. There's no vav in the Torah there. It's because of kupar. There's a dot in the pay, so it's a kubutz here, not a shuruk. V'zar lo yochal ki kodeshem. The non-Kohen should not eat it because these are holy foods. Bamakom shakohen ochel, the place where the Kohen eats these sacrificial foods, uva'et sharoi lechol, and at the time when he's supposed to. Remember, each korban has an expiration date. There's a time when basically the korban is eaten, usually that day, the ensuing night, and perhaps even the next day. Whatever it is, every korban has its prescribed time and its expiration date. Im achalo, chatav patach komatz kolam here. Achalo means achalo to sham hazar. If the non-Kohen ate it there, he is to be lashed. However, im achal hazar basar kodesh kodeshim bachutz. Let's say he ate of this meat, the sacrificial meat that was supposed to be in the Azarah, and now it's been taken out of the Azarah. So now this meat is disqualified. Disqualified meat. Let's say a piece of the korban chatos was taken to the south side of the Temple Mount, where it's halachically Temple Mount, but it's beyond the Azarah. So the second there's a little bit of meat out of there, so it's become disqualified. The Kohanim can't eat it, and this meat should be disposed of. What if he eats it there? If you eat it there, hold on one second. So now you should be lashed for eating it outside the courtyard. Lo mishum zar shachal kodesh, but not because he's now a non-Kohen who ate the kodesh. You could have said, well, maybe he gets two lashes, one for eating it outside and one for being a non-Kohen eating it. Kamash balan, no, he's only lashed for eating it outside the temple courtyard. Sharei eino ra'ui sham lakonim. Why isn't he also lashed for eating that which he should not eat as a non-Kohen? Because this meat is technically disqualified for Kohanim to eat. Why? Because it's been taken out of its place. So Kohanim can't eat it. Let's say he were to eat some of the sacrificial meat. He was very quick. They didn't even get a chance to throw the blood on the altar. Usually it takes a matter of seconds from the slaughter until the blood is applied to the altar. For whatever reason, there was a delay, and he managed to cut off a piece of that animal, and I guess even eat it raw. Sometimes it could be eaten raw, technically speaking. There are ways to do it. You have to wash it properly, as long as there's no blood on the outside. But I digress. The point is he was able to eat this kazayas of meat before the blood was applied to the altar. Lo kam mishum ochel kodem zrika bilvad. His only punishment, he should be lashed again, but on this case, I guess the count is they're prosecuting him for eating meat before the blood was thrown, but not because of zarut. Before the blood is thrown, even Kohanim shouldn't eat. So in this case, he's not punished because he's a non-Kohen. Even a Kohen would get a punishment for this. He's eating of the sacrificial meat before the blood was applied. I keep saying applied. Zrika is as we saw, sometimes the Kohen actually takes his fingers and applies it to the altar. Sometimes it splashes on the altar, sometimes he throws it. These are all called zrika in a general term, even if it doesn't actually involve throwing, splashing the blood or pouring the blood. Zar she'achal kazayt mechatata of. Let's say the non-Kohen were to eat an olive-sized amount from the sin offering of a bird. He is to be lashed twice. The sin offering of a bird, yes, that's to be eaten by Kohen, as opposed to, let's say, the burnt offering made of a bird. Burnt offering of a bird is burnt. Okay, so he's to be lashed twice. Achad mishum zar shachal hakodesh. The first count is because he is a non-Kohen who has eaten sacrificial food that he's not supposed to eat. That makes sense. And another one for eating nevela. V'achad mishum ochel nevela. He's also eaten an animal killed, but not through proper slaughter. That is, the slaughter was done, but it didn't work out so well. So this is very interesting. You have a treifa could have been slaughtered properly. A treifa slaughtered properly. Let's say just a cow slaughtered a cow. It's found to be treif, so the meat is non-kosher. But if you have a nevela, it means it didn't even experience proper slaughter and found to be a nevela. Instead, it found to be a treifa. Just it died some other way. It's technically speaking tameh. Okay, so you would to have a bird. Normally, when we eat chickens, and most people don't eat pigeons anymore, pigeons and doves. Even though in the sages' times, it seems it was much more common. They used to eat pigeons and doves all the time, and they were one of the most common sacrifices. You're supposed to slaughter them. There's the proper way, the same method of slaughter for birds, chickens, turkeys, sheep. It's a smooth knife, and it's supposed to be rubbed. It's supposed to be drawn back and forth across the neck, thereby severing the kanan veshet, the windpipe, and the food pipe. It also happens to also sever a lot of blood vessels, but that's not what we're aiming for when we do slaughter. These bird sacrifices are not slaughtered in the temple. They experience malika, like we discussed before Rosh Hashanah. They're to have their necks popped from behind with the Kohen's nail. And we saw is it necessarily the thumbnail? Is it some other finger? Whatever it is, and the Rambam describes twice how to do it, depending on which type of sacrifice it is. The point is that if a person were to perform milika to a bird outside the temple, that would just be killing the bird and make the bird non-kosher. Whereas in the temple, the Kohanim, who are supposed to be eating these bird sacrifices, have to do the process of milika, and they're not allowed to slaughter them. So it's a special halachic dispensation explicitly granted to the Kohanim that they eat of bird sin offerings in the temple that have not experienced proper kosher slaughter. Instead, they've been nimlakin, as they say. Okay? They've been malikot. I do not know of a proper English translation of such a thing. How do they translate this? It used to be I knew the translations, and I used to stick to the translations, but I don't know of such a thing. Either way, so this Jew who eats of the bird sacrifice is hit on two counts. He's a czar, he should be eating, and he's eating something that's malika. He's something that's improperly slaughtered. Why don't the Kohanim get hit with the second of such sins? Because the Kohanim are specifically bidden to do so. Ukshehutra lakonim hutra. When this non-slaughtered bird was permitted for consumption, lakonim hutra, it was permitted to the Kohanim only. Lo lazarim, not to non-Kohanim. And this is two types of averas that come at once. As we're going to see this in Isuri Bia. We are saying there that a person can do one act, and you would be charged twice for it. It's one act of consumption, yet he is hit with two counts. It's like the person who eats shrutzim, eats certain types of water bugs, for example. He's guilty on 5 counts. So 5 counts of lashes. Okay. Normally, when we have a case of a person guilty through one act of a number of different offenses, and those they come with different punishments. One is to be punished by kares, one is punished with death, let's say, and one is just punished with lashes. So we say, well, he's already punished with death, so the lashes count, we're just going to discount. Kim le b'derabi minei. We're going to uphold for him the greatest punishment. He's already to be killed for what he did, so we're not going to hit him also with a count of lashes, which is unlike, let's say, the Western legal system where they give a person life plus 25, for example. A life sentence plus another 25 years, which makes no sense. But whatever. Not a big fan of the common law system. Let's go on to the 12th parak, God willing. Okay. Well, we have another question. Hold on. Yeah, secular law. But usually secular law doesn't deal with ritual offenses, by the way. Hold on one second. Wait a second. I just lost the camera. How do I get my camera back? Okay. Okay, we're back. Let's close the chat window and go into here. Let's talk about menachos. We've been mentioning menachos, and also previously we had a whole parak talking about menachos, but we're going to get back to menachos. Here's the commandments. We're going to talk about them in very specifically. Meal offerings. Hamenachot hein mina korbanot. They're also korbanot, even if they're not animals. Hamenachot habaoth b'fnei atzman. Let's say you just have meal offerings. They come on their own. They don't accompany, let's say, an actual animal. We saw that person brings an animal sacrifice, whether the person or the tzibur does it. There's also menachos and nesachim. The nesachim are the libations that accompany that. That's derech eretz. But sometimes a meal offering could just come on its own. They're not part of the nesachim. We said minchat nesachim, that is the bread and the wine that accompanies the meat. Mehem minchat tzibur, umehem minchat yachid. Sometimes it's the community sacrifice, and sometimes it's an individual's. All the menachos are made from what we call solet chitim, and we said that this is actually not fine flour. It's the what do you call it? Not the gymnosperm, not the endosperm. Yeah, I think it was the endosperm. The inside of the wheat kernels before they're ground up, and they actually said if you were to grind this up into fine flour, like very dusty, powdery things, so that would be disqualified. It has to be the coarse type, which is basically similar to farina. They actually sell. I've seen it much more in Israel here than, let's say, I saw in America, and they even use it. Traditional Sephardic women make some pretty tasty stuff out of it. Usually, fried, gooey, sugary things, which is pretty good, but it's also bad for you. So, what are you going to do? Chutz minchas sota omer hatnufa. I am very surprised that they spelled sota here with a sin. Normally, the better editions of the Rambam know that the sota, that's the wayward woman, the woman who's to be tested, be put to the test, the trial of the water because of her husband's suspicions and her own suspicious actions. So normally that's spelled with a sin, and that's quite ironic with a sin. The Hebrew letter sin. That's the way it is in the Torah, straying. And the problem is that there's a similar word was spelled the shin, and that's a shotet or a shota, meaning a person who's a little bit deranged. So to differentiate it already in let's say the classical Vilna editions of the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, and there's no Vilna Shulchan Aruch. I mean the Shas, for example, just to make it clear that we're talking about the sota, the straying woman. It's spelled with that instead of a sin, it's with the samich, and that's the way it is. But in the newer editions of the Rambam, for example, the Makbili and in the Korean, they've put it back when they spell with the sin. So I'm surprised Machon Mamre didn't put it back either. Either way, her offering and the Omer Atnufa, that's the Omer brought the second day of Passover. It's reaped, as we saw before, around Passover time and around Shavuos time. This is they reap it right at Motzei Yom Tov Rishon, even if it's Shabbos, and those come from the Seorim. That's barley. It's not a type of wheat. So these two korbanos, that of the sota and that of the Omer Atnufa, the special grain sacrifice brought on the second day of Passover in the morning, those are brought from barley. Shalosh minachot lasibur. Minachoth is the standard plural of mincha, minachoth, and sometimes it's minchoth if it's a smichut, the construct state. So you don't have dots; you have to know what you're reading. So shalosh minachoth lasibur. There are three types of meal offerings. Omer atnufa. There shouldn't be a vav in this one because it's pronounced mil el. Omer hatnufa. That's what we said. It's brought on the second day of Passover. Who karev lemizbeach k'moshe yitbaer. It's burned on the altar. Usually, when it's says karev lemizbeach, it's not eaten. Okay, there's no part that's eaten by the kohen. We'll read about it where in Tmidim Musafim. We have a shir online about this already. You could go find it. There's also 2 loaves of bread that are brought on the day of Atzereth, which we said is, for some reason, Chazal's term for what you and I call Chag HaShavuot. Is very strange because there's one day in the Bible called Atzereth, specifically, and nothing else, and that's Shmini Atzeres. But for some reason, Shavuos is the one they called Atzeres. Okay. These are called mincha chadasha, a new meal offering. But they're not burned on the altar. Instead, apparently they're eaten by the kohanim, and they're also leavened, which is quite a surprise. Normally, it's forbidden to leaven any of these meal offerings. While Ne'emar, and concerning them, who said, Korban Reshith Takrivu Tham LaHashem, Lo Yalu. When the Torah first discusses the prohibition of, let's say, leaven and fruit honey on the altar, it says you could bring a Korban Reshith, a new offering, or the first offering should be brought of those, but they should not be put, or they should not go up to the altar. This Korban Reshith is basically Bikurim. We said that Shavuot is Yom HaBikurim or Chag HaBikurim. It's not talking about everybody's new first fruits. Yes, it's the first day that people could start bringing their first fruits, but Bikurim in the Torah means the Shtei HaLechem, the 2 loaves of bread brought on Shavuos, which answers the question, why is it you find, let's say, in Rashi, in Machlokes, Rashi, I love this little word. How's it go? Is there a mitzvah of Bikurim during the Shemitah year? It's a good question, right? Is there a Bikurim during the Shemitah year? Why would there not be Bikurim? Because normally Bikurim is the first step. A person, let's say, has his grapevine, so he's supposed to designate some as Bikurim to bring to the temple, and then he's supposed to leave some for the poor, and when he picks all the grapes and turns them into wine or turns them into raisins, he's supposed to take out the tithes, the first tithe, the second tithe, the Trumas Meiser, the tithe for the poor, whatever year it is. So Bikurim is just one of the first steps of that which he has to take from the crop to give to someone else, in this case, God's Kohanim. But during the Shemitah year, a person doesn't do any of these things with his grapevine. It's not his grapevine. He's only able to take the grapes that he wants to eat, but he's not supposed to be taking Truma and Meiser and the equivalents of Leche, Shich, and Peah, the parrot and the Olalos, etc. It's not his. So there's no Bikurim. So Rashi says in one place, the Bikurim are also somehow or other in Shemitah year, and then he says they're not. And it's implied, remember someone saying in the Rambam, maybe it's unclear. The answer is personal Bikurim from fruit and one's own crop are not to be brought during the Shemitah year. It's not a person's right to designate them. They're not his. However, the Tzibur, the community, does bring Bikurim. Has the community bring Bikurim, the Shtei Alechem that are brought on Shavuos. That's also called Bikurim, and those are every single year, including the Shemitah year. Okay, so that's what it's talking about. Korban Reshith. Reshith Bikurim Mathacha is mentioned a few times in the Torah. Those are the personal Bikurim, and the Reshith Bikurim, it's called Yom HaBikurim, Bakri V'chem Mincha Chadasha LaHashem. See, it says that in Shavuos it mentions Korban Reshith, and it says Bikurim and a Mincha Chadasha. Those are all languages of some sort of new crop, similar to Bikurim. So that's what's brought in Shavuos. Wa Mincha Shlishith, the third communal grain offering or meal offering is Lechem Hapanim Shosim B'chol Shabbat. By the way, when I say meal, what is meal? So that's sort of old English. In Yiddish also, what you and I call ground, whatever, you grind up something into flour in a mill. So that's called a meal. Matzah meal is ground up flour. In Yiddish, you say mel. So a meal offering means it's made up, ground up grain. That's why it's called a meal offering. Even though, I guess in colloquial English, it doesn't make much sense anymore. People don't understand. When I say a meal offering, what, you're going to eat a meal? Like a Suda? No, it means something that's basically made out of grain, usually turned into some sort of bread, whereas we're going to see some sort of porridge. The third communal meal offering, for lack of a better word, hu lechem hapanim shosin b'chol Shabbat. This is the showbread, the bread with many surfaces, basically horned bread that they would make every Shabbos. Technically speaking, no, they wouldn't make it every Shabbos. They wouldn't bake the bread Shabbos. Remember, the bread is baked before Shabbos, baked on Friday. If Yom Tov is Friday, so they bake it even the day before that. And it says Shosina means the sacrificial rite is performed on Shabbos. What is the sacrificial rite of the Lechem Hapanim? The bread is brought into the temple, and the last week's bread is removed from the table as they're putting on the new bread. That's basically the process. Put the new bread on the table, which has multiple shelves, a table with 5 shelves above it, as we saw before. And the older bread, last week's bread, is consumed by the Kohanim. That's what's done. They know karev l'gabei mizbeach, but it is not burned on the altar, just like the previous korban. Ela kulo ne'echal kohanim k'mo she'itbar. The entire thing is eaten by Kohanim. So you can say, wait a minute, in what way is it a sacrifice? Only one of these 3 korbanos is actually burned on the altar. It's eaten by the Kohanim. How's that a sacrifice? We said before, sometimes God wants his sacrifices to be consumed by the fire, by his angels, and sometimes he wants it to be consumed by his human servants, the Kohanim. For God, it's the same. It results in kapara, an atonement for those who brought it. Every form of sacrifices has its form of kapara, atonement. By the way, let's just make a note. We didn't. The guys aren't here, so we didn't discuss the weekly parsha, triennial cycle parsha. This triennial cycle parsha, we're discussing the Garden of Eden, and according to the annual cycle, we read about Migdal Bavel. You should just know, classical Judaism did not really look at Chet Adam HaRishon as a classical sin. If actual sin had happened in the usual way of saying it, we would say that if one sins to God, then one has to somehow have to have that sin removed. There has to be some sort of kapara for such a thing. So there's no justice. There's no punishment that Adam is technically given. Yeah, technically speaking, he has to be buried. That's his kapara. We talked about this last year. So it's not that every person is guilty and has this albatross around his neck and he has to somehow atone for the sin of mankind. Or a sin of Adam Rishon. That's not the case. The story is basically trying to explain why it is that God has decreed mortality onto what apparently is his most chosen creation. God created man in his image, and made, like the Tilm says, he made him just less than God. And the snake even acknowledged such a thing. So why was man mortal? There's a good reason for that. And the Tower of Babel also, when a person commits a sin between him and God, so he has to have some sort of kapara, some sort of atonement. If a person sins to another man, then justice must be served. The Tower of Babel was not, in this case, that type of sin. It's not that they're punished and a kapara has to take place or people are still suffering consequences. The Tower of Babel is just trying to explain why it is that God wants all nations to be separate from each other. He wants them to be defined. They should each have their own country and their own language and their own culture, and they should stick to themselves. Why? It says Noah's family were bidden to leave the ark, and also the animals go, okay, get out of the ark and populate the earth. And it says quite well that there were 70 nations. It describes all the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and quite a lot of detail how they spread out. But then still, despite that, the people tried to unite for some purpose which they thought was a higher purpose. And the Torah is trying to teach them, no, you're not supposed to do such a thing. That's not what God wants. When Goyim who are meant to be different from each other try to join together, they're doomed to failure. It's destructive themselves, and God wants to stop them. Okay, those are towers of Babel. Okay, let's get back into these halachas. Here are the 9 types of menachos that an individual can bring. These 9 types of meal offerings that an individual can bring are all burned on the mizbeach. Minchas chotei, that is the mincha of a sinner. Okay, who's the sinner in this case? It means that he can't afford some other sacrifice. Okay, the mincha shemakriv he'ani. Okay, the poor person brings such a mincha. Well, it says first of all, ani. So really, if he has some sort of chatas going, so he should bring a proper animal. He can't afford that, so he brings pigeons or doves. He brings a pair of birds. Can't afford that, so he should bring some of this soleth. So he's obligated to bring a chatas, but the problem is he really can't afford it. So tagia yado is an expression meaning he cannot afford it. Literally means his hand does not reach. Minchat sota, pshuta kamashmo, the straying woman, as part of her trial, she's told to bring this mincha, which she said is made of barley. It's also referred to in Torah as the meal offering of the jealousies. Her husband's jealous, or in this case, perhaps not jealous, but more zealous. Sometimes it's with a J, sometimes with a Z. In this case, it's because he's taking charge. He realizes something's wrong, and he's told his wife Kinui. He's told her, you better stay away and don't do anything like that, giving her a specific warning about a specific man. And he says, we already explained this. Where do we explain this? In Hilchot Sota. Hamincha shemakriv kol kohen techila keshiknes la'avodah. Well, the Rambam didn't call it by its usual name, the Minchat Chinuch. He's actually spelled it out. This is the mincha that every kohen brings when he first comes to serve in the temple. He comes of age, perhaps. Let's say he was a kohen who was always around as a child in the Pirkei Kuna. So, or he's already an adult. He's 30 years old. He's finally made it to Jerusalem. He's able to serve. So he brings this special type of sacrifice, shemakrivo tabiyado, and he himself has to do it. Normally, many types of sacrifices, Kohanim do it on behalf of the regular Jews or on behalf of each other. It doesn't really matter who actually performs the sacrificial service, as long as it came from the property, it was paid for by the one on whose behalf it is being performed. V'yanikret minchat chinuch. See, he calls it minchat chinuch, and he could have said the other ones. He explains here. Mincha kotei minchat sotah. He could have said minchat chinuch, which is, in this case, he switched it. Okay. Ha mincha shemakriv kohen gadol b'chol yom. There's a mincha that the kohen gadol brings every single day. It's very similar to mincha chinuch. Here it calls it v'nak create chavitim. Chavitim, it's some sort of expression of beating something. No, sorry, that's with tet. In this case, this is a Mishneh term. I don't think it has a source in the Bible why it's called this. And by the way, the fact that it ends with a nun over here instead of a mem is a clue that it's a sort of Mishneh / Aramaic term. Mincha solet, the mincha that's made out of solet, which we said these coarse flour. Via ba beneder una dava. This is not brought because anybody is obligated. It's brought when a person decides on his own volition. Neder means he promises to do such thing, and dava is when he donates this particular one. We said before, neder means I promise to somehow make a korban, and nedava means this particular thing shall be a korban. And there's different rules that govern those and his responsibility to bring it. Mincha machavat, the fried mincha, the machavat we said was the flat frying pan. Okay, just enough to hold in a little bit of oil. It's also brought because a person has chosen to promise to bring something or has volunteered to do it. Minchara marcheshet, which is the deep frying pan, deep fried mincha. Also, it's also brought. A person volunteers to bring it. Minchat mafei tanur chalot, baked loaves of bread, as opposed to fried. These last two times are the solith, which is basically some sort of porridge we just saw. That's also brought voluntarily. Minchat mafei tanur rikikin, or flatbread mafei tanur, as we said before in all our sources. You look in Targum, you look in Rashi, you look in Ramban and Maimonides. They all say rikikin is not, as the propagandists want to say, it means crispy bread or crackers. It just means flat bread, but also soft, almost spongy, like as Onkelos translates, is pogin, spongy. And once again, also this is brought voluntarily. So these 5 types of menachot that a person can bring. When we are discussing these meal offerings that are burned on the altar, the minimum amount is an isaron. Hold on, let me turn the page here. He said an isaron is about 2.6 liters of flour, according to Rabbi Chaim Noah, which seems to be, from the evidence we have, that's basically what the Rambam was talking about. According to the Chazon Ish, it'll be almost about 2.5 liters of flour. Umi uto me'akevet kulo. If you're missing a little bit of it, so that's a problem. You have to have the complete isaron. Okay. If it's any less, let's say 90% of an isaron, so it's not good enough. It could be more than that, but it cannot be less than an isaron. No less than an isaron. These 5 types of menachos that we described, the porridge kind, or the 2 fried kind, whether deep fried or shallow fried, and the 2 baked kind of the bread or the flat bread, the loaves or the flat bread. So you can make as much as he wants. We have a question coming in. Guys, shh. Hey. Shh. Thanks. Okay. Favorite Sefer Divrei Yamim. We're going to discuss that. I have a note over here. There's a word in Sefer Devarim, and I have it over here. That's a hapax legomenon, like a Talmud. There's yeah. I was hoping Yaakov would mention this, but he's not here. Hapax legomenon is a Greek term meaning a word that's unique to one place in the Bible. Okay, it just occurs there once. So Divrei Yamim is the latest book of the Bible. Its spellings are differently. It uses different methods. Obviously, it's post-exilic, and it obviously takes pieces from other previous writings, sometimes other previous books of the Bible, or other things that hadn't been included in the biblical corpus, and it changes them. One of the best examples that people see is the name David is usually written throughout the Bible, especially in the Nevi'im. There's no yud in there. You know that to read it with a chirik gadol. Yet, in Divrei Yamim, I guess so that people don't read it as dod or dude, which are two other words that occur there. Yeah, they actually spell it with a yud. Okay, they actually spell it with a yud there. So chavitim occurs there, but that's because of the hashpah. Another example is the word talmid. We are looking in the Chavos Avavis in classical Bible. In the classical Bible, you don't have the word, let's say, like Talmud, which is a common biblical word. It's a common rabbinic word. What's the old biblical word for Talmud? Anybody know what we call a student of someone? It's called children, banim, and it's used all over the place. Bnei Nevi'im are the students of the prophet, and Rashi points out in a few places in the Torah, why are Aaron's sons called Moses's children, his sons? Because they were his students. Okay, so banim is the usual word, and suddenly we have the word Talmid, one place in our Bible, and it's in Divrei Yamim. Talks about Leviim who are learning to play music. In this case, it doesn't mean classically Talmid, like the sages used, a student of a master, of a teacher, of the rabbi, of the chacham. Instead, it means someone who is still learning the ropes. He's still learning, let's say, as a Levite, how to sing, how to play the music. So that's called a Talmid. It's not even used the way the sages would use it. So we have a few words like that in Divrei Yamim. They're unique to it, and so this is one of those unique words. So it seems that chavitim is something they picked up in Bavel, and they used it to describe that which always was there. Another example that doesn't occur in Tanakh is, of course, Sanhedrin. There's always the 70 elders. 70 elders are all over the place in the Bible. The 70 elders exist even before Yetzias Mitzrayim. But the fact that they were called a Sanhedrin, which is it's the name of the Masechta. It's the name of the halachas the Rambam describes. That's a totally Greek word. Okay, so the 70 elders existed even before we picked up this word. Minchad Chavitim existed even before we went to the Gullus and picked up a word for it. Talmidim existed even before we went to the Gullus and decided that we're going to use this word over here. Or esrog, for example, the Ramban claims that it used to be called a hadar. It's still the Hebrew word for citrus. So an esrog is hadar in the Bible, and they picked up the Persian name, and that's why Chazal referred to an esrog throughout the Mishneh. Okay, very good. Glad someone picked that up, and you can see we even had it marked here. We're going to talk about that word. See, Yoni, if you could see that, I made a note on chavitin. It's from Divrei Yamim, hapex legomenon, just like the word Talmud. Good thing people are paying attention. Yeah, we have lesson plans here and everything like that. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, I'm sorry about the guys coming in here. A bunch of youth are coming here. We just tied tzitzis. We had a tzitzis drive for the soldiers. We participated in tying tzitzis. There are many soldiers who want to keep the mitzvahs. Thank God. I pray that just like there are many soldiers who have had an awakening, they want to keep more of the positive commandments. God should bless them and allow them to also keep the negative commandments. They should all become Shomer Shabbos. They should all keep kosher. They should all want to fight a war according to the dictates of the Torah. I was speaking to someone before, a senior Rav, actually. Maybe I should go apologize to him. I told him I was quite surprised. I don't understand how so many good Jews participate in the military system, a military hierarchy, which demands, above all, following orders of the commanders. It doesn't make any sense. As Jews, we're supposed to follow God's orders. And God has told us there's certain red lines. And the Jewish people, when they fight a war, they're still supposed to be following God's orders. And they're not supposed to just listen to whatever commanders say. That's not a Jewish value. They're supposed to fight the enemy as though there's no tomorrow. They're supposed to just put their entire lives in God's hands and do what he demands of them and not even think about, let's say, like the rabbi said, their families back home. and they're not supposed to think about sins. They're supposed to be pure of heart, and they're supposed to keep God's commandments. And the problem is, for some reason, they take good Jewish boys and they train them to be soldiers. And the problem is, you have to learn to be, and I think one of the classic political scientists and philosophers said, you have to be a good citizen. You have to obey the law, but not too much. You have to know when a law is unjust. So too, you can't be a robot. Many regimes, anti-Torah regimes, totalitarian regimes, murderous regimes, rely on the fact that there's a certain amount of people, like I said before, Hitler's willing executioners, who are able to say, I'm just going to be a robot for the regime. I'm going to be a soldier for the regime. I'm going to be a policeman for the regime. I'm going to be a KGB agent for the regime, a Gestapo from the regime, a Judenrat policeman for the regime, because following orders is the highest value. And that's certainly not the case. Good Jewish people think on their own. And tyrannical regimes rely on people who are too easily becoming robotic. I think I mentioned this last week. You have to think on your own. You have to be able to know what is right and what is wrong. The commanders are only supposed to show you how to fight the war, but they're not supposed to dictate to you morality or ethics or chas v'shalom to even tell you how to use your force for the wrong purposes. So the prayer is that soldiers who are getting these new tzitziot, these new garments with tzitzis on them, just like they want to keep these commandments, they should also learn how to think like God's soldiers and not just any other soldier in any other army. Okay, let's see this. It says here, so you can make his mincha as big as he wants. La mincha to Omer, this Omer that's brought on the second day Passover, minchat chotei, the Omer of the sinner. The mincha of this sinner, the poor person who can't even bring a full animal as a sin offering. Uminchat knaot, what the sota brings. Uminchat chinuch, the Kohen's first time, his initiation sacrifice or his inaugural sacrifice. Machavitin, what the Kohen Gadol brings every single day. Kol achat mehen isaron echad. By the way, I do not believe that even though the minchat chinuch, the Kohen himself, the first timer does this himself, the Kohen Gadol does not have to bring his own chavitin every single day. I think someone else could do it on his behalf. We'll see that when we get there. These menachot do have a minimum. It's also isaron, but they're no more. Okay, they're exactly an isaron. All of these meal offerings that are burned on the altar, to note hagasha b'marav keneged chuda shel keren dromit ma'aravit. They all have to be presented at this the southwest corner of the altar. Okay, they have to be at the west side of the altar. That's the side that's facing the temple edifice. That's not the entrance side. So it's on the left. If you put north on top, so this is to the left of the altar. At the southwest corner, Dromit Ma'aravit, that's where that's the side that has the altar, the ramp. The ramp is on the south side. Ve'enan tunot tenufa, but he doesn't have to do tenufa. He has to bring them officially, but they don't have to do the tenufa. We said what is the tenufa? He raises it up, mali chamoli, up and down, back and forth. That's usual tenufa. Chutz mi minchat sotah, except for the offering of the sotah, as we saw before. The Kohen actually helps her. The Omer Atnufa, and also the Omer, which itself, as it says specifically, it has to be waved. That's the Omer that's brought on the second day of Passover. Both of these meal offerings are to be waved and also officially brought. How do you bring them? You put them in a special kli. The Rambam will explain. To note shemen ulvanah. See, same category. All the menachos that are brought to the altar, that are burned on the altar, they have to be brought with oil and frankincense. It's a type of spice. It's actually quite rare and expensive, but it has to be brought. It was also ground up. Now, whenever we say oil, minastam, the only oil that they refer to in the temple is olive oil. Olive oil is stam oil. If they refer to some other oil, they're usually going to have some modifier there. And the person cannot substitute the olive oil. It has to be olive oil. Also, the menorah is lit with olive oil. I would say, usually they say this before Hanukkah time, the olive oil was the finest of the oils. It also burns the cleanest. Nowadays, technically speaking, for your Shabbos candles and like your Hanukkah candles, you want it, if you want your Shabbos candles to burn well, so the best thing had was olive oil. Even olive oil leaves soot. Our paraffinic waxes burn even cleaner than that, so that'd be superior. For Hanukkah, you're burning it outside, so really there is no standard. But for some reason, the minhag nowadays we saw, they transferred a lot of the standards for Shabbos candles they put on to Hanukkah candles also. But Hanukkah candles, if you want to burn clean, don't use olive oil. So I wonder, what would they use in the temple? they still stick to olive oil? Yeah, because it's explicit in the Torah that the light of menorah has to be olive oil. But perhaps, a future Sanhedrin would say that to avoid all the soot, we'll switch to some sort of superior modern oil. I don't know. It says here they have to bring with oil and levona, log shemen lecholi saron. And it's a log of shemen. How much is a log? We said 1 log per mincha. If I'm not mistaken, a log is about 300 ml. Okay, yeah. Look back. That's Rova Kav. It's 300 ml of oil or so, according to if you say that it's 2.16 liters of flour is the saron, so a log is 300 ml. If you were to have a log, which is basically a 12th of a hin, and the revius is a quarter of this, a quarter of 300 to 75 ml or so. So that's how we get such a what we understand to be revius nowadays. Okay, where was I? Over here. Yes, log shem el saron. The kometz levona l'chol mincha. A kometz. How much is a kometz? A kometz, well, that would depend on the kohen, right? I haven't seen an official shiur of how much a kometz is. Basically, a kometz is as enough as you could grab. Some say 3 fingers, but according to this, the way we understand the Rambam, it's actually 4 fingers without the thumb. He knocks it off with the thumb. So that's not so much a fistful, but it's not something they would even measure with let's say some sort of measuring cup. Bein shayatha yisaron echad, bein shayatha shishim yisaron. And by the way, this kometz, the log shemen for every saron. That means if you have 2 esronot of flour, let's say 4.32 liters of flour, so you need 600 ml of oil to come with it. But the kometz doesn't increase. It doesn't really matter. Bein shayatha yisaron echad, bein shayatha shishim yisaron. A person is very rich. He's magnanimous. He wants to bring to God 60 times in Isaron, which is about well more than 120 liters of flour, and he's going to be bringing, quite a lot, almost 20 liters of olive oil as a sacrifice. It's still just 1 kometz of frankincense. She'ein mevi'in bechli echad yater al shishim Isaron. There's, he says, there's no kli that's more than 60 saron, as we'll explain. Okay, that's what Rambam picked it. He didn't say 100. 60 was usually the most they would consider. Okay, and he's going to explain that later. The exception is once again the mincha of the sota. In this case, he calls it minchat kanot instead of minchat sota, like he said over here, and the sin offering of the poor person. Shnemar lo yosim aleh shemen v'lo yitin aleh levona, should come with no oil and no frankincense. Okay, that's referring to the chotei. These 2 people, the sota and the sinner, are sinners, so their korban symbolically is lacking these certain areas. Derech eretz, Chazal said, for example. So the sota doesn't bring oil and no frankincense, and it's barley. Says she behaves like an animal. She is Maisa Behema, so she should bring a korban that's fitting for an animal. Hold on one second. Another question was in. Yes, I see there. I noted it. Okay. Let's see. Here's the next halacha. Nathan v'hikriv. I have an arrow pointing here for some reason. Oh yeah, they make a note here. The Smag disagrees with this halacha. Smag says no. Even if you increase the flour, more esronot, there's still just 1 log of shemen. Log echad bilvad. It doesn't matter the size of the meal offering. How many esronot? The plural of isaron is esronot of flour. It's just 300 log. Okay, 300 ml. Fine. Let's see this next halacha. Nathan v'hikriv. Let's say a person does put the oil or the levona on these 2 sacrifices that should not have it. Lokal shemen b'fnei atzmo. So he has to be lashed for placing oil on this offering. V'al b'fnei atzmo, and also for putting a levona. Two separate acts. 1 act of placing oil, 1 act of placing the frankincense. He is to be punished for both of those. Nathan kli sheyesh bo shemen o levona al gabeha eno aver v'lo pasal. Let's say he puts a kli that has oil and frankincense mixed into it. He just puts this cup or whatever it is on top of his meal offering, lo pasal. So he hasn't ruined it. It's not touching it. Okay. Hold on one second. It has to actually be in the mincha itself. Yeah. Okay. Go and point it out. Thank you. Nathan kli sheishbo. We saw that. Mincha chinuk v'achavitin. This initiation sacrifice for the Kohen, the first timer, and the Kohen Gadol's daily similar sacrifice. Each of those, you're supposed to add oil to them from that very log itself. Okay, you're supposed to add more oil, and we'll explain what that is. Okay. All of these menachos that are to be burned on the mizbeach, so they're nikmatzot. That's the part that's actually burned. Nikmatz means they take out a kometz from it. How? Maktrina kometz kulo al gabe mizbeach. The entire kometz is burned on the mizbeach. That's not a lot, but that's what he has to do. The kohen reaches in, takes out the kometz, burns it on the fire. Vashar nechal kohanim, and the rest is eaten by the kohen. So it's kind of interesting. It's called mincha that's brought on the mizbeach, but it's brought, it's eaten by the kohanim. The very small amount of it. You're talking about 2.6 liters of flour, and already a significant part of the kometz is, the lavona itself. So how much flour does it actually leave for the kohen to eat? It's the vast majority of it. Perhaps even not even a percentage is burned on the altar. If it's a mincha brought by male kohanim, zichrei kahuna, as opposed to daughters of kohanim, which we saw as also a specific category, those aren't she'ena nikmetzet. Instead, those are not. It doesn't take out a handful of it from the korban. Ela maktiran ota kula. The entire korban itself is burned on the altar. Shnemar v'chol mincha kohen. We're going to get into these details now. So wait a minute. Say the kohen, completely kohen person, his mincha is entirely burned. It says v'chol mincha kohen lo teachel. It should not be in kolil toktar. Okay. I think that's what it means. Yeah, it should be burned entirely. Okay. Hine lamata sheminchat chinuch. So now you know that this minchat chinuch, the initiation sacrifice of the kohen, that's a meal offering. The chavitin, that which is brought for the kohen gadol every single day. The kohen shevi minchat choteo minchat nedava, or a kohen who's poor, so he brings a sin offering of a poor man, which is a mincha, or a kohen volunteered some sort of meal offering. They're all entirely burned on the altar, and they're not nikmatzot. And like I said, oh man, if I can have a word like this, what's the translation of nikmatzot? They are not handled, because a person is supposed to take a handful out of it. I don't know. Someone, where my throne for a student who could come up with good words for these processes or these nouns over here. In this case, nikmatzot is technically a verb. It's a passive verb, but I don't know how to translate it properly. Okay, here's the koheneth. Who is the koheneth? We're going to see that in this case, the koheneth is referring to the kohen's daughter. Okay, why? Because it'll imply we're going to talk about a woman married to the kohen subsequently, so it's talking about the koheneth is as a kohen's daughter. The kohen's daughter, I guess let's just assume she's unmarried, so she is volunteered to bring a mincha. So the kohen, her brother or her father, who's processing it, or whichever kohen does it, takes out a kometz from this, burns on the altar. The rest is eaten by the kohanim. That's the shirah. The rest of it eaten by the kohen, just as though a regular Jew had brought a mincha. Vladot shenit arvu. Oh, this is a scary case. This is babies switched at birth. Okay. A mess up in the maternity ward, a Pudd'nhead Wilson case. What happened? They mixed up the babies when they were young. One of them is the regular Jew. One of them is the Kohen. You don't know which one. So they each grow up the Safek Kohen. So they have to have all the thou shalt nots of a Kohen. They don't go near the dead, and they have special rules about who they can marry, but they don't allow such people to actually serve in the temple. How often did this used to happen? That was a case mentioned a few times in the Mishnah. I don't know. Nowadays, such a thing could be solved very easily with a DNA test. You know who the parents are, but in the old days, they didn't have that. Minchatam nikmetzet kiminchat Yisrael. So they take the kometz as though it's a regular Jew's korban, and not a kohen's. But it cannot be eaten because it might be a kohen's sacrifice. So what do? First, they burn the kometz as though it's a regular Jew's korban. Because either the kometz would have to be burned or the whole thing would be burned. The sharim and the rest of it, mitpazrin al beit hadashin. They scatter it at the Beis Hadeshin. We said Beis Hadeshin is where they dispose of all the things that have to be taken out of the Beis Mikdash and burned outside. There's 3 places there called Beis Hadeshin. The point is that it's disposed of elsewhere. Question coming in: taking a handle from it. A handle? They say a handle and not a handful? Okay. I guess it's a handful. Okay. Go Safaria. Hold on 1 second. Hold on. You have to put this on the screen. Sorry, I'm not.
Sorry, handful.
A handful. Okay, good. Yeah, that's what I figured. There's a. Okay, we're back. We didn't get disconnected. I'll try to reshare it. Internet's not perfect. Screen is loading. No, it's not what I want. Sorry. Do you see it? I'm trying to put the back. Okay, there it is. Fine. Okay, so that's if you've had such a crazy case of a particular Jew. You have at least two people now. Every time you have Vladot Shinit Arvu, it's at least two people have the status for the rest of their lives. Safek Kohen, Safek not Kohen. Really scary. Okay, so both of them or the three of them who are mixed up, whatever it may be. You just say, but is there bittul in this case? One Vlad Kohen gets mixed up in 100 of them. Yeah, because I'll deal with these questions. Okay. Kohen Suoth La Kohanim. Whoever are married to Kohanim. Sometimes, by the way, Kohenes is a term used for both the Kohen's wife and the Kohen's daughter. So you see here, Nisuoth La Kohanim, women married to Kohanim, which means, like I said over here, this Koheneth means the Kohen's daughter. Here's the Kohen's wife. Okay. Ben Koheneth, Ben Yisraelith, whether she was herself the daughter of a Kohen or a Yisraelith. If she's the daughter of a Kohen married to a Kohen, I'd figure, so treat her korban like that of a Kohen, not necessarily. Ein shirei min chotem ne'acholim. Still, what happens? You treat them as though it belongs to the Kohen. You can't eat, the Kohanim don't eat the rest of the mincha. Why? Because the Kohen's involved. The Kohen is basically owns his wife's property. He's the real owner. So these women are married to Kohanim. They're bringing meal offerings. So the meal offerings are not to be eaten. They're to be burned because they're owned by the Kohen, partially owned. See, there's a part of it. But it cannot be entirely burned. But they don't belong on the altar. They deserve to be eaten. Why? Because they're a woman's, and a woman's not a Kohen. Ella kometz koriv latzmos. So what do? Take out the kometz. The Kohen takes out the kometz, burns that on its own. Vasharim mitpazrim al beit hadeshen. And just like this other case of the Safek Kohen, the rest of the korban is not burned on the altar. It's not eaten. It's also scattered in the beit hadeshen. And this actually is subject to dispute. Let's see here. According to the Tosfos, okay, in this case, the Tosfos said that this isn't in the Beis Hadeshen. It's done in the place where they would burn the disqualified sacrifices, also somewhere outside, apparently on or near Har Bayis. In this case, this is Rashi and the Rambam. He says here, Dinhu b'chol menachos. This is talking about all the menachos. It's the same din. And others say no. There's actually the dispute over there. Look at what the Ravid says. Okay, if you have a Ravid, he says HaKorbanot minchata nikmetzet. You have this daughter of the Kohen, so her mincha is to be once again have a handful taken out and the rest are burned. So the Rambam says Kohenet zo lo yadati mahi. I don't know what he means by Kohenet. I'm a little bit confused. Im niseit leKohen arei kvar amura, v'im niseit l'Yisrael minchata ne'achelet. Okay, if she's married to the Kohen, so I know the halacha, and if she's married to an Israelite, so she's no longer. There's not even a question that she's a Kohenet. It should be eaten the mincha. So I understand this right. Say so. Why don't you just say it's a daughter of a Kohen who's not married? I understand the Ravid's question necessarily. It's a little bit tricky. Getting back to that previous halacha, some wrote shegam kasher ein lebal zechut mimonith b'mincha zo hamincha ina ne'achelet. For whatever reason, if it's somehow the woman's independent property, it's not owned by her husband. That was like one of the conditions they're married. And if she acquired this, I'll deny that it not become part of her husband's property, as I mentioned a few times in Shas. So the Rabban says that it still shouldn't be eaten. Others say, no, if somehow the woman, you can find a case where the woman really has her own property independent of the husband, and the husband's a Kohen, so this korban would be considered in the regular Israelites, korban should be eaten. Right? Tosfos says in the same Rishomi, there's another one here. Rak mincha sota shel eshet kohen einan ne'achalet. Okay, oil mincha of a sota of Kohen's wife, chas v'shalom. That's the one that's not eaten, but the rest are eaten. Okay, so you see there's quite a lot of disputes here. Okay, 12th halacha. We're going to turn the page over here. Hakamitza. Where do you do kamitza? Well, a sacrifice is slaughtered mostly. It depends on the sacrifice. Some sacrifices have to be slaughtered on the north side of the altar, whatever that is. We saw 2 days where the north, what's considered the north side of the altar. That's slaughter. But for kachi kalim, you can slaughter anywhere in the temple courtyard. So too the kamitza. But choma komba azara. I have a note over here. No, we're not there yet. Okay. V'im kamatz b'eichal kshira. And even if you did in the heichal, for whatever reason, also we just had a case before. Some or other, something ended up in the actual temple edifice, and that's where they did the kmitza. So it works. We'll have to walk back downstairs out of the temple and burn it on the altar, but it was there. This is an interesting one. Normally, we said when they catch the blood, the kohen is there to catch the blood from the slaughter of, let's say, the sheep or the goat, whatever it is. So he has to catch it with his hand. In this case, a person puts the sacrificial vessel, usually made out of metal, supposed to be made out of metal. He puts it on the ground, and the fellow brings in the flour, and he's measuring out an isaron of flour as his meal offering to God. So this vessel is not in the kohen's hand. It's not even on one of the tables that were there in the temple courtyard. Instead, it's right on the floor. And also, the kohen, instead of holding this kli in his hand and taking out a kometz, he actually takes the kometz out from this sacrificial vessel that's still sitting on the floor of the temple courtyard. But it doesn't become kodesh that way. Okay, the kometz, as opposed to the sacrifice itself, what happens to the kometz? He's supposed to take the kometz into his hand and then put that in the kli, and from there transfer it to the fire. The kometz has to go through this rite of kiddush. So basically speaking, the kometz gets 2 acts of kiddush. There's the first kiddush of the entire mincha when it's put into the kli. And then there's the kiddush of when the kometz is separated from the rest of the mincha by the kohen in his hand and also put into a kli. So in this case, that secondary act of sanctification, that's what kiddush means, has to be done with the kli already off the floor. So when can the kohen actually take the rest of this meal offering and go ahead and start eating it? Once you see that the kometz is starting to burn properly. Sometimes you go to burn the chametz on Erev Pesach. So people are throwing in too many things. They're almost smothering the fire. So you see that there's a pita there. There's a challah. Pesach is going to start lo adu rosh, lo badu Pesach. Okay, Pesach doesn't fall out on a Monday. So instead it's going to be Tuesday. So Monday morning, there's still some challahs left. You see someone, quite a lot of leftover challah, puts it into the pile, this burning pile of bread or whatever it is. Unfortunately, some people put plastic bags, and you see Cheerios boxes there. You can't just say, "Well, I threw." Technically, it's considered beer chametz. You threw it into the fire; it's fine. But you see, the bread is still there. You can still recognize it's going to take a few hours maybe before the flames actually catch up and this bread turns black. Okay, so that's what it means. There's a certain part where they see the kometz has actually caught fire. Not everything thrown directly into a fire catches fire right away, and sometimes it catches fire very fast. So it's once this happens, so that's when the kohanim can start eating it. I have a note here. A priest was not supposed to throw the kometz directly onto the fire, though. Okay, understand? He has to put it into the kli. It doesn't just goes from hand directly onto the fire. Instead, it has to go into the kli. Next one. All of these menachos that are brought onto the altar. By the way, we said krevot al gam mizbeach. Yeah, if it's a kohen's mincha, if it's talking about Israelites, it meant just the kometz, but they're matzah. Matzah means the state of unleavened. Okay, that's a very important thing. You have a lot of cases matzot ye'achel. We said before, matzot is feminine plural and says ye'achel, shall be eaten. It says matzot te'achelna. The verb shall be eaten should fit the feminine plural and not the singular masculine. No, matzot ye'achel means the bread, which is singular masculine, should be eaten in the state of being matzot. Okay, unleavened. Hold on one second. We got a message coming in. Thank God there are people participating in other places. Okay, fine. My daughter sent me something. It's just a joke. Okay. please limit messages that come in during the shir to that which is relevant. Okay. Also, whatever pieces of the korban that the kohanim eat, whether it's that which is burned on the fire, that which the kohen get to eat, so that should be matzah. Technically speaking, just like the meat of the korbanot, they could actually prepare it any way they want. They could eat it. It's their meal offering. They could eat it the same way they like. They could add whatever condiments they want. Even with devash, they could take date honey and put it on there. Even that's something that you're not supposed to offer on the altar, just like leavened food, any leavening or anything that's become chametz. But they could, technically speaking, they're not supposed to leaven their menachos, but they could put honey onto it. In this case, honey, by the way, means date honey, not bee honey. Ein ochlin ota chametz, should not be eaten leavened. Shnemar lo teafech chametz. It should not be baked leavened, and I have given them their portion from my fire offerings. That's what God said. Even their part that the kohanim are given to eat, that's saved from the fire, they should not allow to become chametz. And if someone, one of these kohanim, did allow or allowed it to become leavened or leavened it, there's two ways you can make it leavened. One is you get it wet with water and just let time go by, so it naturally happens. Or you actually add some sourdough, some starter. Nowadays, we don't necessarily use that. Instead, we just use yeast or whatever. In the old days, they didn't have dry yeast or a way to do that. They had to use sourdough starter if they wanted to get it going. Loka. So he used to be lashed. And someone who adds a little bit of sourdough as a starter after someone already did so, he still he used to be lashed. Or he caused to become chametz after someone else did start the process. It doesn't really matter. They're both to be punished for such a thing. Okay. It says here, Velokin al kol asiya v'asiya sheba. And someone is to, I have over here in Korean, it's singular. He is to be lashed for every single action. Every single action is an independent action for which there's a punishment. Kitzah. Let's look at the example. Lasha chametz. He kneaded it with a K. So he let it become chametz by adding water to it. Oh, irva chametz. He mixed it up with chametz. In this case, it means he wasn't just every mincha has its way. You have to shape it afterwards. You mix the water and let's say the flour. So there are four different ways to do it. We saw he can make flat bread. He can make cakes, chaloth, or he could prepare it for deep frying or for shallow pan frying. So that's what he's talking about here. Oh, kitafach chametz. He what's the proper word here? I guess he cut it into pieces while it's chametz. Oh, afayah chametz. Okay, not afiyah, afayah. He baked it in the state of chametz. It's loka. Remember, chametz is something happens when a fork gets into the oven. People forget this also Passover time. Once you throw your dough into the oven or onto the grill or whatever it is that's baking, you don't have to worry about, oh man, because of the heat, it's going to become chametz. No, chametz what happens when it's a dough and it's not being worked. But if it's being worked or if it's being actually baked or fried at this point or boiled, whatever it is, it can't become chametz. Nemar lo te'aseh chametz. It shall not be made chametz. And also it says, Nemar lo te'afeh chametz. It should not be baked chametz. Don't make it chametz and don't bake it chametz. L'chayev kol ma'aseh yechidi sheba. And this shows you that a person is to be held accountable, liable for any single act in this preparation. Asayah chametz mitchila v'ad sof. Let's say it was chametz from beginning to end. Okay, the entire process was chametz. Lokel al kol ma'aseh mehen. So he's to be lashed for every single process: the introduction of the chametz, and the kneading it, and the arranging it, the cutting it, the actual baking process or the frying process. You get a lot of lashes. What did he do here? He had the dough, and he takes a piece of sourdough starter, and he just puts it right on top. And he goes away, sits down, takes a break. And that caused it to become that was somehow enough to introduce the right yeasts in there, and the dough became chametz. Lokeh used to be lashed. Just placing the dough. Normally, the way you do it is mix it in. You mix in the sourdough, and that gets it going. But in this case, you just touched it. It's enough. And we'll conclude this halacha over here. We're finishing a little bit early this evening because we're not in person. Tibel shayraim baketzach. Let's say he spices it with ketzach. What is the proper word for ketzach? It's one of the usual spices around here. I forget what they call it in English. Okay. This is a common thing, just like nowadays in Israel, they put on za'atar, and even then the za'atar is not really za'atar. They put a lot of other different things to cheapen it because they know if it was actual za'atar, it'd be more expensive. They want to make more money. They put in sesame seeds and other things. Oh, b'sum samim. See, sesame seeds. Even nowadays, they do that. Uv'chol mine tvalin ushmanim, or other spices or types of oils. Kshera, you could do that. The worry was, by the way, that what would these things do? They would cause chametz to happen. They make the flavor change. Kamash malam, they don't cause chametz. They don't encourage the leavening process. Matzahi, it's still matzah. Elish and a great matzah metubelet. It's called matzah metubelet. Is there nafkamina with regards to the way we prepare matzah? So you look in the Ravid over here. Let's look at the Ravid. Finish this. Amar Abraham nireli b'matzah afuya nishneit. This is talking about baked matzah. Okay, it's in Menachos. It's in he gives the source, Menachos 23b. Shemutar le'achol shireh b'tfalin ve'en choshashim levitul ta matzah. The chashash would be what? That it's not that it causes leavening, but because it causes a change in the taste, and it doesn't taste the way it's supposed to taste. If you're talking about the mincha of soleth, the one that's made sort of like a porridge, which we're going to see, perhaps you wouldn't be allowed to put in all these spices and things because that would cause the chimutz to happen. Okay, there are disagree, of course, with this idea. Okay, why should spicing cause chametz? I remember one of Rabbi Bar-Hayim's kulas is there was a chashash, a later chashash. This isn't mentioned in the Talmud, that adding salt to the mix when you make, let's say, your matzah dough for regular Passover, it shouldn't become chametz. So Chazal talk about how salt causes things to get warm. Obviously, it doesn't cause, it says a reticha, a boiling thing. So you put on salt on your wound, you feel like it's hot, it burns. And you get salt also too much on your lips, you feel a burning sensation. So Chazal associated salt with heating things. And there's also the heat of solution. You mix certain things, you dissolve certain salts in water, and there is sort of a heat generated from it. So the sages felt that salt caused things to warm up. You don't want your matzah dough to become warm. So there was a chashash later in history that you shouldn't salt your matzah dough, just even a little bit, because that could encourage the leavening process. Of course, we know that that's not actually what happens. As a matter of fact, adding a little bit of salt discourages the leavening process. It still happens. So putting a little bit of salt in your dough, if you want to make a good pizza dough, you actually should put in some salt. It actually helps it with the taste, and of course it leavens. If you put too much salt into your flour, let's say you mix in a certain percentage, you're making just flour and water and a lot of salt, so you'll get a very salty dough. It will not rise, period, because there's too much salt there. Salt eventually, at certain concentrations retards the microorganisms that allow for the leavening to happen. But because of this chashash, how do you know? There's no way to measure it. There wasn't any scientific research done into the matter. They said you shouldn't be salting your matzah in its dough form. You could perhaps salt your matzah afterwards. It's totally fine. Everybody agrees that you can salt your matzah after it's baked. So one of the things that the Rav allowed very explicitly was you could put a little bit of salt into the dough for taste purposes. And it so happens that my daughter saw them doing such a thing and said, yeah, but he made it too salty. They prefer, let's say, my recipe. I barely add salt, if any, and I think it comes out better, but that's just personal taste. But there's technically speaking, those who hold like the Rambam and have investigated the matter see that adding a little bit of salt into the dough does not cause leavening. We'll close with a prayer that God grant us peace through victory. If chas v'shalom, things were to just stop right now, there would be no hostilities. Am Yisrael has lost. Am Yisrael has lost territory. Am Yisrael has lost people of actual people. There are many captives among Am Yisrael who need to be redeemed, who need to be saved. By redeemed, I don't mean given ransom. Normally that's one translation. I mean rescued. There's territory of Eretz Yisrael. There's people of Israel who need to be rescued, and there is a deterrent factor. The deterrence that's necessary that can only be achieved through an act of victory and defeat of the enemies. So that's what we pray. We should have peace upon us through proper victory in war, as God has told us to do so. Also, we should live to see the reinstitution of the temple service and the keeping of all these commandments speedily in our days. Have a good Shabbos, everybody. Be well. Questions, comments? No? Okay, so we'll sign off there. Any other comments, you can send to me, PM to me.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.